Hey Fanatics, Dave here with another video tutorial from LightroomFanatic.com. In this tutorial, we're going to go over the options for your adjustment brush and explain what each one of them does. To get started, let's open up the adjustment brush panel by clicking on the adjustment brush icon or using the shortcut letter K. The options that we're going to talk about today are size, feather, flow, auto mask, and density. The first option is size, and that one's pretty self-explanatory. The smaller the number on the slider, the smaller the brush. The larger the slider, the larger the brush. And as a quick tip, you can use the bracket keys to change the size of your brush with the keyboard. The next option is feather, and the feathering option controls the softness at the edge of the brush. With no feathering, the transition between your effect and the surrounding pixels is a hard edge, and with a higher feathering value, there's a much softer blending of your effect on the image into the surrounding pixels. So let's see what that looks like. I've got an adjustment brush here with a -4 exposure, so it's pretty dramatic. And we'll create a brush here. So when I apply the adjustment brush, you can see I've got a pretty defined circle. Now if I bring up the feathering option, you can see around the preview for my brush, there's a second circle that gets bigger around the inner circle. So the inner circle is controlled by the size slider. The feathering circle controls the outer circle. And the higher that value, the softer the transition will be between my effect and the outside area. So let's do one here with a value of 25. So same deal, I'm going to apply my adjustment brush here, and as you can see, there's a much softer transition at the edge for my effect on the image. And if I bring the feathering value up even higher, let's say to 50 here, you'll see once again that the effect is even softer at the edges. The next option we're going to talk about is flow, and flow controls the speed at which your effect is applied. So let's make a little smaller brush here. So with a flow value of 100, when I apply my adjustment brush, I'm applying a -4 exposure along the length of my adjustment brush because my flow is at 100%, so that's as fast as the effect can be applied. If I reduce my flow and do the same thing, you'll see that it's not as strong of an effect because I'm not applying it as quickly. So if I do a couple more brush strokes and cover the area, you'll see that eventually I get the same -4 exposure change caused by the adjustment brush as I did when the flow is at 100. So it really just lets you control how much and how quickly you want an effect applied. So it's really a matter of giving you more control over your brush and how quickly you want an effect applied to a particular part of an image. The next option we're going to talk about is density. And density and flow sometimes can be confusing. So flow controls how quickly the effect can be applied. Density caps how much of an effect can be applied. So again, I've got the same adjustment brush with a -4 exposure, and I'm going to go ahead and draw the same line that I did before. Now I'm going to change my density to 50. And when I draw this adjustment, you'll see that it's not as dark as the first one, and that looks sort of similar to what was going on with flow. But one of the differences with density is that no matter how many brush strokes I apply, it's not going to ever get as dark as the original adjustment, which was a -4 exposure. So actually this density value of 50 means that I'm applying 50% of the adjustment that is defined for the brush. So in this case, my exposure change is a -4, and that's what you're seeing on the top line. I've capped it at half of that, which is a -2 exposure. And an interesting thing that you can see to compare is I'm going to go ahead and create a new brush here that is half of my -4 exposure, which is a -2 exposure. And I'm going to bring my density back up to 100. So now I'm applying 100% of a -2 exposure, and you'll see that it is exactly the same as the capped using the density slider exposure from the first brush. So one question you might ask is, why use the density slider at all? Why not just change my exposure value down to a -2 and control it that way? That's a really good question. When you only use one slider, it's pretty easy to do. You create a new brush, move the slider to where you want it, and you're fine. But when you have a more complicated brush that might have more options, more changes that you're trying to make to the image, if this is my brush and I want to apply it pretty strongly in a bunch of areas, and then I don't want it as strong in some other areas, but I want the same changes and adjustments to be made, instead of figuring out what half of all of these values is to create a less drastic effect, I can use the density slider, bring that down, and apply the same exact adjustments using the same brush, but I can cap the effect that it'll have and lessen basically the amount of adjustment that can be applied. So it's a really nice way to control how much of the effect that you want applied to a particular part of the image, but use the same brush. So let's get rid of these brushes, and let's go back to the auto mask option. So auto mask basically tells Lightroom that you want it to try to decide, using colors and contrast, where the edge of something is, so that you can apply a brush to a particular part of an image. So in this one, I don't have auto mask turned on, and I painted my brush stroke, and I've got part of the behind the fence and part of the fence post, and it's not really the effect that I wanted. So now I'm going to turn auto mask on, and I really only want the effect to be applied to the fence. And as you can see, Lightroom is trying to figure out where the edge of the fence is so that it will only apply the effect to the fence. So depending on the image and depending on how much contrast and color difference there is between the area, Lightroom might have a harder time figuring out where the edge is. But for things like eyes and portraits, Lightroom does a pretty good job figuring out where the edge of something is. So when you're doing sharpening brushes, for example, to sharpen the eyes in a portrait, try out that auto mask, and it'll probably help you. It'll probably help you have a more controlled application of the adjustment to the eye without needing to create a super small brush to fill in and stay along the inside of the lines. And the final thing we'll talk about today are these A, B, and erase links. So the erase one is your eraser. So this controls the size of the eraser that you want to create. So if I want to remove an effect, that's my eraser. It also has a feathering option. So if you erase with a feathering option, you'll see that it has the reverse effect of a feathering on the adjustment brush itself, and basically the edge of the eraser is softened. And the same slider for flow works with the eraser, and that controls how quickly or slowly the erase actually happens. So a lot of the same options there, including the auto mask. A and B basically lets you create two different brushes for your adjustments. So let's say you want to have one brush that is really big with a no feather and a high flow, and then you want to have another brush that is a little bit smaller with more feathering and a smaller flow. So now by switching back and forth between the brushes, you can see that it remembered those options, so you can switch between the brushes pretty easily. One of the things that doesn't change with, or doesn't get captured with the different brushes, is density. So wherever you move the density slider to, it gets applied to both brushes. So just keep that in mind when you're switching between brushes, that if you moved your density slider, you may have to move it manually if you're looking for a different effect. I hope you found that tutorial useful. For more Lightroom tips and tutorials, remember to check us out over at lightroomfanatic.com. While you're there, sign up for our newsletter and receive a free copy of our Lightroom Performance Boost ebook. Check out the resources page for more resources, links, and discount codes for Lightroom and some of the tools and plugins that I use. And be sure to follow me at LRFanatic on Twitter, where I tweet about Lightroom and photography and where you can ask your Lightroom questions. Take care, and I'll see you next time.